to 2026 FileMaker Pro User Group, Dallas, Texas. I'm Taylor Sharp. I'm one of the 3 chapter coordinators here, along with Paul Mitchell and Greg Price. We're glad to get a new year started, and things are certainly exciting. We're glad you're joining us, everybody that's in the room here, as well as those that are joining us virtually. Yesterday, Claris had a community live event where they had a little bit of an intro into the new features in FileMaker Server 22.0.4, which we're going to talk about today. And this is going to be obviously a little bit of a follow-up on that. Okay, for 2026, you're planning. There is again no Engage, DevCon, or anything planned by Claris. However, there is a full access conference August 24th to 27th. It's in California. It's somewhere near San Francisco, generally. Monterey. Okay, there we go. So anyway, but it's the second time that they will have done that. They did their initial one this last year. I went to it. It was a fun little conference, and I hope a lot of you might be available to come. It's going to be a 3-day conference, and it's going to be right there on the beach and supposedly very scenic, but also hopefully a lot of good FileMaker learning that we'll do on whatever the latest is at that point. So put that on your calendars. One other thing I did learn from the community event yesterday that I didn't know about, all those DMG files we have for the different installs for over the years, I didn't know there was a little link out there that has where all of those files are. I used to hoard them in a folder somewhere, so if you ever really want them, FileMaker has a website, FileMaker or Claris.com, either of them /redirects/ss.text, and it has the links to all of them for way back. I was really impressed. That was a little thing Rick Kalman shared yesterday in the community live event. Okay, today our sponsor of our event is Zerowait. We have Mike Linett and some of his guys here. We certainly appreciate them helping out. They are hardware experts. If you're just a software guy but you need help with the hardware end of things, Mike and his team really know how to take care of that end of things, and that probably describes me, so I've done a lot of learning from them. So Mike?
Thanks for joining us today. IT environments are growing more complex by the day, and finding a solution that keeps everything running smoothly can be daunting. What if I told you that there's a way to simplify while future-proofing your infrastructure? So let me introduce you to Zerowait SimpleStore Enterprise Server, a robust all-in-one platform designed to empower your team with the tools they need to thrive. SimpleStore integrates seamlessly with Proxmox for powerful virtualization, FileMaker for intuitive database management, and ZFS for advanced file system capabilities. This unified ecosystem delivers unmatched resilience against failures, lightning-fast performance for demanding workloads, and ironclad data security to protect your most valuable assets. Whether you're a system administrator, a developer building innovative FileMaker applications, or an end user requiring high-speed, reliable access, SimpleStore meets you where you are. And the best part, Zerowait's expert engineering team doesn't just hand you the hardware. We craft a tailored, converged solution, complete with managed services that handle everything from setup to ongoing optimization. And it's not just FileMaker. Harmonic's presentation next month about their AI-powered solutions integrating Claris Studio, Claris Connect, and FileMaker to support durable portal forms could be deployed on Zerowait SimpleStore hardware, Proxmox, and ZFS. I'm really looking forward to our presentation today from Clay. And if you want to chat about how we can help you meet your FileMaker performance needs, let's talk over lunch. Over to you, Steve.
Welcome, everybody. It's a warm January day here in Dallas. Happy 2026. We have a real treat today with Clay Maeckel, Claris software architect and OG FileMaker guy joining us. I try to catch all of Clay's sessions, and I'm really looking forward to this one. I bet a lot of you are as well. And so with that, we're all excited to invite Clay here to Dallas as a fellow Texan. He flew up this morning, and take it away, Clay. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello. When they asked me to do something here, it was like, what shall we talk about? And the problem is that a lot of stuff has been changing at Claris this last year, like what our release schedule is going to be like. And this version 22.0.4 was originally going to be like called a 21.1 release, and it was going to have more features in it and stuff like that. But there was other products that were all depending on things to be done earlier, so things got shifted around. So this is why we're calling it beyond the usual update. So for I guess a few of you that I guess don't know me, I don't know, but I started at Apple in 1986. I was working on the Mac terminal and other network technologies at that point. Claris was formed in 87. I was the 15th employee to join up, to leave Apple and to join the company. I was actually the first engineer. Everyone else were like execs or admins and stuff like that. Claris was doing a bunch of other stuff. I don't know, we were working on something that would have looked like Notes, but I thought much better than Notes. But Apple squashed us from releasing that, so that never came out. And then Notes came out. But I started working on FileMaker in 89 on the Windows version of 1.0, Pro 1.0. That got canceled. Then we started up on 2. That got canceled again. And eventually, the Windows version came out. The presidents of Apple kept changing, or the CEOs of Apple kept changing during that time frame. And one would like it, one wouldn't. Well, we kept going back and forth. And then later, the Draco engine came out as the replacement for what was written in the original FileMaker. And then 40 years later, I'm still working on this stuff. And there was supposed to be a bigger release at the end of 2025. And then they decided to push that off into FileMaker 2026, most of it. But some of this stuff was actually required for other things that were coming out earlier, so we actually had to push it out. So this is why it's strange that we have a .vrev, what we call a vrev release, containing full features of some sort. The first one is just finer grained developer options in the privilege set. That had there's some large customers that we promised we were going to be giving this to, and they really wanted it. And for developers, it makes it easier, or for when you're managing a solution, it makes things easier to use. The OData improvements was another thing, and that was really needed for Claris Studio, Claris Connect, and Claris MCP, the Model Context Protocol server that you're going to learn a lot more about next month. We're pushing OData to be the new way to access FileMaker data from other products and other sources. Now, in the announcement for this session, we were going to be talking about remote backup support, but unfortunately that got disabled at the last moment because even though all the code was finished in the product, with the changes, I'll get into more details about that, but that ended up getting disabled. So unfortunately, there is no remote backup in this release, or in this dot release. And then at the end, we'll have an Ask Me Anything, and then when we get to that slide, there'll be some things that you probably shouldn't ask me about because I really don't know about it. So first going into the fine-grained dev options that were in there. So when you bring up 22.0.4, the big UI change now you'll see is in the privilege set dialog box. There's now 2 new checkboxes in there that you can add to a non-full access privilege set. Still is something that you really can't modify. It gives you full access to everything. But now you can give some other user some more finer grained support. Before you had a checkbox for manage extended privileges or manage accounts that didn't have full access. That stuff was in there too. And so this is just really a continuation of doing stuff like that to open up other parts. Now you can give the select users the ability to develop more of the custom app without having to have them worry about them changing the encryption key for the encryption at rest stuff, or mucking around with the full access privileges. And then if you just want them to have custom functions that they can add for their script steps, you can add that without having to give them access to the actual data table support in the back end. Also, as part of this, you don't see it in the UI, but if you have permissions, previously if you had permissions to edit a layout, you weren't able to edit the themes and make changes there or manage themes or add. So now, if you have permissions to modify layouts, you should be able to do all the theme level support for the layouts too. And then full access is still required for actually a number of features, mainly related to access and encryption. So this is the list of things that you still need full access to do. So granting scripts the full access permission, that's in the script manager. Manage the full access accounts, this is the only way to do that. Creating new privilege sets, changing the encryption at rest, as I mentioned before. Authorizing one file to access another file. That one kind of like sets on the edge of whether do you really require full access. We started thinking about, because the list of checkboxes of things that you're allowed to do and not would grow pretty large if we give each one of these things separate permissions to do. So right now, you need full access to do that. The file options dialog, you can't, right now if you don't have full access, I think all you get is the spelling tab is all you can do something with, and that still requires the full access. Using the data viewer, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Save a copy as XML and save as database design report. Those things, you really have to have a full access account to do any of that stuff. Everything else should be able to be done using you can just create another privilege set that gives whatever tables the person should be able to have access to. Actually, if you turn on the option, that checkbox saying give manage, it does actually force you to give them permissions to see all the tables and manage them. We may still be tweaking some of this stuff, so I guess we want your feedback if you're using this and you have developers working on a solution, making changes to it. There's been a lot of discuss going back and forth, the data viewer versus debugging. Right now you can debug pretty much everything like you have full access, but the data viewer was restricted because there was some concern about what stuff you could see in the data viewer since you could type in any type of calc. I think we're thinking of changing that probably in the next release, that you'll have full access to the data viewer. So there's still some more tweaks on this stuff. So don't say that this is all set in stone. Actually, you guys should go out and play around with this feature, and if you have sub-developers or you have different teams working on things, and see if you can actually do your workflow using these new options. A late thing that came in that we realized that brings a lot more weird things into using this feature is that, so there's a feature in the developer tool, and it was in the dialog that's in Pro to do it and the command line developer tool, where you remove full access support from a file. Now, it doesn't just remove the privilege sets and doesn't allow you to set someone to have the full access privilege set, but it also goes through and strips all the textual representations of the calc out of the file. Now, if you do give another privilege set the option to manage the data tables and stuff like that, if you go in there, the calcs will show nothing, basically. But you could type in a new calc, and it will probably then get saved. But we're trying to decide what to do with this full access removal feature now, and how does that interact? That's something that came out after people started playing around with it. They're saying that, I know Kent from Kmart, all his databases that he pushes out to all the schools, he removes full access from all his databases. And he wants other ways to be able to debug that stuff later and stuff like that. You removed full access, so you can't do development on it, but now you still want to debug it and watch it and stuff like that. So it's an odd line that we're still debating over a bit. If you play around it and you think it should work some other way, make sure you report this on one of the Claris community forums. We have written a blog about this whole topic, about the developer options, fine-grained developer options. There's a QR code for it, and if you go and look at all the different blogs that we post on the community site, you'll be able to get to that and see, it goes into a lot more details and stuff like that. But for my purposes, it's really, I'm still looking, I guess, for more feedback, because there is going to be a FileMaker 2026 coming out, and I think we even told everyone that the version number is going to be 26 also, so you won't have to keep playing around with the problems of, after Apple decided to do that now too, their version numbers now match the year, and so it makes things a lot more simpler from our point. I still haven't figured out how to get the Claris Cloud team to stop calling it 2.22, but because there was Claris Cloud 1 was the first version where it was, you had to spin up the AW instance, and then Claris Cloud 2 was the more, we do everything for you. So that's what that first number, but I don't think there's ever going to be a Claris Cloud 3, and it's just, and the other problem is it burns up another digit, so where do you put the version number? It's a mess handling it internally, but it's amazing how many things get hooked into that version number when you start dealing with all the sale data, Salesforce, and everything else, and everything's hooked to these numbers and stuff like that, and you can't just change them in one place in the code. We can do that pretty easily, but then it breaks everything else in the company. Now, OData improvements, this is what I think was the bigger thing why we had to push this stuff out all earlier. So the big improvements was more support for the system fields row ID and row mod ID. In FileMaker, in the internal format, we don't call it a primary key, but some people think of it as a primary key. It's a number that gets reserved for a new row. Now, this number is reserved whether the record's going to get committed or not. So if you go through and you create a bunch of things, create a bunch of records, and then throw them away by reverting, or by aborting the commit and stuff like that, those numbers are lost forever. So they never get, and they're always increasing, they never get reused. It makes a good primary key for FileMaker's usage. Unfortunately, it doesn't make a very good primary key if you're dealing with other databases systems or if you're trying to move records from one database to another database, because you can't set these row IDs. They're all handled internally and managed internally, because even as different clients are going on, it's sometimes, depending on if you're doing imports or other large sets of changes, it'll actually start reserving ranges of numbers for a particular client. So if you have two people doing imports, you'll see the mod IDs are coming out in different chunk rows based on which client was doing it. But they're always increasing and they're always unique. So that's the main problem inside FileMaker, but you can't ever change it. And if you import those records into another FileMaker table, you get a new row ID. So in the database theory logic, it's not really considered our primary key, but as long as you're dealing with the one FileMaker file and stuff like that, everything inside the Draco engine is basically based on that row ID. It's really hard to change that. And as you've seen the other features coming out with being you get the found set and you get an array of all the row IDs, and then now you have calc functions that'll take you to make that the found set and stuff like that. But that's all using those internal row numbers that are currently internal. And actually, even internally inside FileMaker, those things aren't usually even stored as numbers. They're usually stored as these sparse bitmaps of single bits. So, bit 560 says that's the records. The ranges of rows and ranges, and this is how the indexing works. When you have like this word is in these 14 records, you'll get, it may be a very small chunk because it's just 14 bits turned on. Now, if there's a large range, the sparse bitmaps have different implementations, but that's how everything pretty much moves around when we're doing finds, queries. How the indexing works is all on these sparse bitmaps of these unique numbers. And it's really hard to change from that. And so that's why when you get into ESS, dealing with that, what ESS is doing is taking the primary key that the SQL database in the backend says, and then we generate basically row IDs for it. And then in the shadow table, we have this big map of mapping the primary keys to our internal row IDs, and then everything inside the FileMaker still works with row IDs at that point. But that can cause problems as you start changing primary keys if you're editing primary keys. That really gets FileMaker confused at that point. There's probably some good reasons to do it, but now we're exporting that out through the OData API. It was in there in the FileMaker data API and in the XML API. You pretty much had full access to that. And you would see that in the snapshot saving of that feature. You saw the row IDs there, but OData, it really wasn't it was in some places, but it didn't work everywhere. But now we're making sure it works everywhere. And then row mod ID is really just the simpler. The ID it gets incremented every time that row gets changed. And with OData, if you want to detect a collision if someone else makes a change, you can actually do a filter on your patch statement saying that the row ID must equal this. And if it doesn't, you'll get an error coming back saying that, oh, someone has modified that record while you were making your changes and made the submit. So you can do your optimistic locking that way, going through OData. The other big thing that we found out, as I was mentioning that we're using this for like Claris Connect or Claris Studio, is that it didn't show up when we were testing simpler files. But if you get some of these FileMaker files with hundreds of table occurrences in them and thousands of fields even sometimes and stuff like that, how the metadata in OData worked was that you give the file and then it gives you the metadata for everything all the time. And this thing could be like megabytes in size if you take an old style FileMaker file that's been sitting around for a long time. So we've given a mechanism so you can filter down the metadata to a particular table or a particular table name and stuff like that, which is not a standard OData feature. The metadata now includes the table and field comments. It's also going to be, as the AI features in FileMaker keep improving, there's going to be more ways to specify information about fields and the data, and that stuff will be visible in the metadata too at that point. So that's not being saved right now. You have to wait for a new version of FileMaker to get that stuff. Immutable table and field names. Another problem that when they were doing Studio is that, and depending, if you stick with the FileMaker way of doing things, you can change a field name and then to whatever you want, and it'll just work automatically. You don't have to worry about renaming it. Now, if you're doing like execute SQL or evaluate, then you start running into these problems because then you have to go through and change where that name was in your code. Or then the common practice now call get name from the actual field to get what the current name is and then pass it into there. But instead of doing all that stuff, we now have these alternate names. Much like how I was talking about row IDs have this number that keeps increasing and are never reused. The IDs for tables and fields work the same way. So it's always a number that's always incrementing. So there's another way, and we'll talk about this later. And the thing that seems to have gotten some of the people more excited is having actually webhooks in here. Some of these improvements have been around even before the 22.0.4. I think they started showing up in 22.0.1. But we never wanted to make it public because we were mainly implementing it for Studio and Connect, and then eventually MCP too. And we were finding things that needed to change, or we would change the protocol. So that's one reason why some people have been talking about, hey, webhooks are actually in the product already. But we have been changing some of the names of things that are in the JSON payloads and stuff like that, and changing how things work. At this point, at this patch release, or this VREV, we figured that we had things stabilized enough to, so really what we're doing is just basically publicizing and giving out the documentation saying that, okay, now you guys can actually use this. So I'm saying how we were doing this to improve the data connectivity and the synchronization. Studio uses it when I don't know if this is, I think you hear it talked by other places where we call data everywhere. So in Studio, you can now say, oh, I want to connect to this FileMaker server, this on-prem FileMaker server, and I want to share the data in that table with my table. And basically what it's doing is it's doing sync. It's keeping two tables in sync. So it's using so you drive it from the Studio side, you go through, you say, point to this server, this file, here's the privileges to access it. And then Studio will go through and use OData to download the data and copy it into the Mongo engine that Studio is using it. And then as changes come on the Studio side, it'll push them down, use OData to push the changes back to the FileMaker side. And it uses the webhooks to learn when changes have been made on the FileMaker side to then pull the data back into the Studio side. Even though I know we've been saying that we're never going to do sync, I guess we're actually now doing sync. Now, but we've left that up to the Studio team to figure out how to manage all the problems with sync that we never really wanted to deal with inside FileMaker directly, like with collisions and that stuff. So you'd have to actually talk to the Studio team how they do that. What we've been doing on the FileMaker team is basically adding all the tools that they needed to do whatever type of implementation they want with it. Like I said, I'm really like the Draco or FileMaker architect. So basically the Studio Connect and MCP teams are giving us requirements that OData need to return for them to do what they want to do. We're doing a lot more work in there. And the next point is that we actually want OData to be the replacement for the FileMaker Data API, and actually for the on-premise servers, ODBC and JDBC process that actually manages ODBC, and because there's a FileMaker ODBC driver and a FileMaker JDBC driver. These things actually use a custom protocol that talks to a process that's running on server, then that makes the Draco calls going on internally. We've been wanting to, and having a custom network protocol runs into, you have to keep track of the latest security issues with that, the type of encryption you're doing over the TCP IP requests and stuff like that. For that reason, and that's why the HTTP protocol version of talking to server using the HTTP protocol instead of the RCP, because some companies just want to run everything through, they want everything to be an HTTP stream of some sort, so they can run it through their proxies so that they can do analysis on it, track, looking for secrets coming out of it or whatever, they're no telling what they're doing. It's basically a big man in the middle type of attack, but it's the company wanting to see what's coming in and out of their network. So the goal is to basically, we're going to rewrite, so there'll be new FileMaker ODBC and a new FileMaker JDBC driver coming out that won't talk to that old listener. It'll talk to the OData listener instead. So it'll be making OData requests. This is why in some earlier releases, previous in the earlier year, we've been adding more of the aggregate functions and stuff like that to basically be able to do everything in OData that you could do with the ODBC SQL requests. What's odd is that internally, there's this binary representation of a SQL statement that's called FQL. You may have heard that sometimes. It's not really a textual representation, it's a binary representation of a SQL statement. And that's actually what the ODBC driver and the OData code actually uses right now. So it is actually doing basically like SQL style requests underneath it, because that's the code that can ignore the join graph and do outer joins and the different types of extends. Getting the terminology, OData uses all this different terminology than the SQL does, but it's basically the same things. So that's something that'll be coming up at some point, is that there'll be new drivers that'll just use the OData listener, and then we'll get rid of the XDBC listener that's in the server product currently.
Will that also roll into ESS so that we could do ESS that way?
So ESS is the opposite direction. That's FileMaker Draco talking to SQL data sources and stuff like that. That doesn't use any of the FQL logic. When you're talking with SQL and FileMaker, I see it as basically two big different buckets that don't really overlap much. You have the ESS, which is FileMaker making SQL calls to create shadow tables, and then there's FileMaker as a data source using all these different APIs, whether it's SQL, OData, the FileMaker Data API, the XML API.
Like if you could make shadow tables of OData, that would be awful convenient for a
Well,
developer.
yeah. The whole preference inside Claris now is to clip it around, is to just use OData to talk to FileMaker and not have FileMaker trying to talk to all these other data sources with the ESS Plus, as they call it, with how FileMaker can talk to Studio. The Studio team really would prefer us not doing that, because it was causing them a lot of havoc, as they kept changing their data types and stuff like that to make it compatible with, since you can't VREV the application nearly as quickly as you can VREV web-based solutions and stuff like that. If you change the back end, you can change the front end, and then everyone's in sync all the time because everything is being hosted from its source. But if you have to have a FileMaker client and Studio adds a new field type that we have no idea what it is, how do you represent it? You'd have to wait for a VREV, or if they want to change how their container fields work. I think that's one reason why the container field support has not come out with the ESS Plus, because the Studio team keeps changing how they want to reference and store containers, or I guess they call it binary data, I think, in their side. But FileMaker doesn't nearly change nearly as fast as Studio is. So the OData is the more stable API to talk to for all these other data sources talking to it. And then the last major reason for all these changes was to give developers, developers want to know when data changes. I can see a lot of different sync solutions that are out there currently may want to start using this, because this gets you more immediate response when there's a change and stuff like that. They don't have to be scanning or putting in scripts and triggers and stuff like that to notify the different syncs. So I think mirror sync and stuff like that, and especially so they'll probably be using maybe multiple protocols, and they may stick with using the ODBC right now for doing some of the work, but then they'll have an OData just to do the listening for changes. It's interesting. The Claris MCP is doing this right now. The current version of the Claris MCP actually uses both the FileMaker Data API and the OData API to talk to a FileMaker file. That's because OData doesn't give them enough visibility into the scripting system that's inside FileMaker. So in OData, you can trigger a script to run, but you have to know what the name is. There's no way to retrieve the names of the script steps through OData. There's other things, like for MCP, they want to know the script, and then they want to have like schema information. What does the script do? So we can tell the AI, this is the script, so that the AI can figure out what the purpose of this script is and stuff like that. So that's going to be some future changes to OData coming up, is that there'll be either a new metadata entry point, or maybe it'll just be as part of the metadata listing all the script steps that are available, and then the more like the comments on the script step coming out, or The AI team has other things that they're adding into the file format to give more information, so you can store for tables and fields and stuff like that, to give AI more data to chew on to know what the purpose of that thing is. But yeah, so the webhooks is one of the big things. The plugin architecture started getting some notification handling inside there, but we needed something more general that you could use with that you can go over the internet and would actually work on cloud. Now, one thing I have to say is that all these changes, there's still some issues. I would say really only use this with the on-prem servers at this point. I'm not even sure we're saying that it actually works with cloud yet, but we're running into data center to data center, having webhooks going back and forth between these different protected networks that are internally, and we're running into a bunch of interesting issues that I have no idea about because I don't know what the architecture of these Apple's different security. They have all these walls around different networks, and who can talk to what, and what the whitelists are, and how you open them and close them, and that. So for the row ID and row mod ID, I gave you the history of what they are. So now you'll be able to. So if you don't define a select statement in an OData request, you basically get almost all the fields back, but you don't get the row ID, you don't get the mod ID, and you no longer will get summary fields by default, because summary fields are usually pointless coming from OData. But if there's a new prefer a header instance in there, you say include special columns. So there's this concept of special columns in OData, and I think it's in ODBC too, or in SQL. If you turn this on there, then row ID and mod ID will come out automatically if you give a blank select statement. Now you can always say select with all the field names that you want, and you can add row ID and mod ID into that. But the studio team just says we always want the row ID and mod ID in addition to everything else. They didn't want to have to keep building select statements, and though they may if they start doing partial syncs, but that's up to them whether they want to do it or not. But for now, they want all the fields plus the row ID and mod ID. And if you include that header, you'll be getting those. You can use them in the selects, the filters. You can use it in order by. I was wondering about that a couple days ago, so I actually tried it. I'm not sure why you would want it. You could do descending row ID order. Actually, I thought maybe you can do order by row mod ID to see what records are changing most often. So you could sort all your records and say, I want the top 50 records, the ones that have the highest mod counts that have been incremented on them. So you can kind of see hot spots in your data, which may be useful. I was just surprised, and then I saw it work, and I said, okay, what could you use this for? But that's one thing, is you put things in here, then you developers out there always find interesting things to do with, wait, you did what with what? And it happens. And then the other thing, so in the standard OData request, for those of you that don't know OData, I'll give you some resources of what you should look at for that. When you specify, so usually you give the host name, the file name, the table name, and then in parentheses after the table name you give like the primary key. This is the standard way of doing that. But you can actually, instead of giving the primary key, even if it would know what a primary key would be, you can actually say row ID equals blah, so you don't actually have to worry about what the primary key is, how it's been changed. That makes it a little easier to use that way. So I mentioned how large the metadata can be coming back. So now there's a syntax after the metadata. This is something that we may tweak before, but the syntax we thought was, okay, you would just say metadata and then hashtag and then the name of the table, and you will only get the data for that. But there's a lot of tools out there that eat hashtags in URLs, which turned out maybe that wasn't the best choice to do it that way. But it seems so reasonable, saying, I just want this portion of it, instead of maybe trying to do a query with a filter for a name of the table. But it does work as long as you use %23 that's the hex code for hashtag. So depending on what your client is, like Postman strips it, a lot of, if you send the raw URL directly with a TCP/IP pipe, it works with the hashtag. But that's not how most people talk to OData, writing your own TCP/IP code to do that. The metadata now, so there's a @fm comment tags in the metadata that gives you that's where the table comments and the field comments come out. And there's going to be new tags showing up after that for more AI related type information in case. Currently, right now, I think how most of the AI features in FileMaker are working is that it does send the comment fields over. I think you have to put something like AI bracket or something like that in the comment, and then the AI script steps will send that to the back end, the AI script. But you have to go to an AI session on that. But I know, as I mentioned before, we're getting all these requests and things that the AI team wants and stuff to do. So they want to have better control and better ways to give out this portion of it. Something else that'll be coming up in a future version of FileMaker is being able to rename the fields and be able to not rename the fields, but have aliases for field names. So you can keep your SSZ underscore 14 underscore primary key or something like that. But then if you want it in the sort dialog, you'll be able to say, for sort dialogs, display this name instead. So probably be taking advantage of more of that for like export and table view and other things like that. You'll be able to tag what name you want visible for those purposes. And then something else I wanted to remind is that the FileMaker SQL system tables, like FileMaker underscore tables and FileMaker underscore value lists, actually works in OData. You can specify those tables and get that information. That has actually always worked. So in the metadata, now you see these immutable names I mentioned about. So there's an at table ID, at field ID. There's another prefer header file. It says, okay, instead of returning field names using the name of the field, use these immutable IDs. And the last two lines on here show you what the IDs look like. So for FileMaker field ID, colon, and this big large number, which is the internal ID representation. And then table IDs just by themselves are FMTID. And then as the scripting comes out in a future version, there's going to be an FMSID for the IDs for scripts too. So it's all going to work in this style syntax. If you turn on that preference, it's going to be really hard to read the output coming from the OData because it's going to all be these number IDs. But that's actually what Studio wants because they don't want to worry about what the actual name of the field is. They have this ID, they map it to their internal ID, and it'll never change. No. And then there's the webhooks. So there's new non-standard OData entry points where you can add a webhook, get all the webhooks out there, get an individual webhook, and delete a webhook. The URL, same style, host, file, and then webhook to add. In the payload, so that's a post statement, you give the name of the URL that the webhook gets sent to. So you register this thing, and then when FileMaker ever detects a change, we'll make a call to that URL that you passed when you registered this. You tell it what table you want to watch, whether you want to get notifications when the table schema changes. You can specify custom headers that need to be sent along with the payload when it goes to that URL that you specified, because you may have some type of security system or you may need to pass a token for that host to be able to accept that request. And then you can add like select or filter at the bottom there saying only return these fields whenever a record changes. And then you could actually add a filter, add a standard OData filter on it saying that will only return things in this department. Or you could send, based on a record from a certain department, you can send those changes to different URLs if you want. It's pretty flexible how you want to distribute it out. So when you do the get on the webhook, it returns this showing, this is the response coming back from it. It'll list all the webhooks for your account on that file, showing you what the ID is, and use that ID to individually get it or delete it. The hook that you specified, the headers that you specified, and the select and filter. And then the get all will actually even have a pending operation, will actually have a list of operations of pending webhooks that it hasn't successfully sent yet. So you'll see that getting a little bit larger. And then if you shut down OData and then start it back up, that'll be saved in the file that it has. So keep trying to send those webhooks eventually. We've had some requests to put being able to configure the maximum number of times to try, or after a certain time just give up and stop sending it. We've been noticing some problems with that, with people running it for longer terms, that the amount of data we're having to keep because they forgot that they turned off their webhook receiver, and then OData just keeps trying to do it over and over again. And not in this version, but in a future version, you'll be able to see that in the log files too, instead of having to go to do this call to get the list of webhooks and what status it's in. Now, what the receiver gets at the end, and I've been using webhook.site for my testing purposes. There's multiple ones out there to do this, but this is what the payload that it would see with that request I have. You see the text of the change data, the row ID, the mod ID, And the type of operation is based on whether you've got a post operation is for new records, a patch will be for record modifications, and a delete is for a record deleted. Now for a record deleted, you only get the row ID coming back from it. And if for some reason all the records in the table got deleted, you'll get a -1 saying that someone did truncate table on it. So you'll know that, well, everything's gone now. So for trying out OData, I tend to use Postman. They actually have a pretty decent Postman OData tutorial collection. So you download Postman and you can download this collection and you can point it to an OData source, and I found that as a fun way to learn how to use it. And then I mentioned I use webhook.site, but there's hooklistener.com, webhook.cool, and there's a bunch of different sites out there. And then John Renfrew, he has like a 5-day OData tutorial session, I think that Richard Carlton created. And he's the one that's been mucking around with this a lot. He's the one that figured out the whole webhook stuff even before we announced it or told anyone about it. So he was actually posting some articles and saying, here, I don't guarantee this, but try this out, it's cool, and it's coming out soon. And then I mentioned about remote backup. This is something that's going to be coming out in FileMaker 2026. It's basically having the on-prem FileMaker servers use the FileMaker data, or the Claris FileMaker Cloud's backup mechanism, storing it into the S3 storage and doing that. As I mentioned, the code is basically done, but licensing, sales, I don't know why it always seems hard for our sales department to figure out how to sell something. And then you have to change the store pages and stuff like that. We can write features, but then if they can't figure out how to sell it, so it's on hold. And so this is to be expected by the FileMaker 2026 server release. So now, get to the Ask Me Anything.